Of the break. Shh. Everybody wants to go hacking. Nobody wants to listen to one more talk. Cool. Okay. Um, Hello, everybody. Good job, Peter. There is way more people this time than last time. Uh, Last time it was a lot of talking and not much doing. I'm participating in the much talking, not much doing actually right now. But hopefully after this, people are gonna go off and build some stuff. So what I have for you folks today is 3 thoughts. I was too lazy to make one thought that would fill the 15 to 20 minutes to 30 minutes maybe if we go crazy. So I have 3 thoughts for you guys. The first one is a challenge, something I've been thinking about a bunch. And when people work on-chain games, there's a bunch of like classic issue that comes in, like, and I feel like they all are like kind of like a facet of the same underlying challenge people have been working on for a long time. One is like the bot issue. So how do you essentially put together a system that anyone or anything can participate in, where your game or your world doesn't get immediately dominated by machines and not fun at all. The other one is the programmer game issue. So I've been a perpetrator of this thing, which is, hey, if you're a developer, the first idea that comes to your mind when it comes to let's make a world that people can participate in and improve and is somewhat machine resistant is to let programmers do their thing and essentially like put together something half-assed. I mean, it's not half-assed, but essentially it's like not finished. And that like creates fun for a very specific kind of people, but I think it might just be a red herring or like a local maxima. Um, I needed a third problem for visual weights, but I couldn't find it, so I had this one there. So yeah, that's the bot issue. How do you build a world that is not immediately dominated by machine? Programmer one is like, we know a brute force way of introducing progress in the world. When we think about how do we add like engineering or research or science to something, you really quickly go to like, okay, let's like let people code on top of it in order to play, right? And I think that there is this almost false dichotomy, right, between like, okay, so it's either a game of skill and machines will dominate, or it's a game of chance and now it's gambling, right? I think it's pretty easy to fall into a pit where it seems like these are the only two outcomes. But I think that there's actually a really interesting, and I couldn't find much in the literature about it, but like idea about like the idea of like traversing context, right? So as an example, if you put together a game and you say, hey, you have to put a stake as an example to play or something like that, and whoever chooses the image or the word or whatever that the least amount of players will choose win other players' stakes, right? That's a very basic game. It's not a game of chance. It's not exactly a game of skill either, but a machine will do very poorly at this. There's like an interesting like crossing of context that happened where if there was like gun to your head, someone was telling you have to play this game as well as you could, you actually can put together some pretty interesting strategies of first figuring out who plays with you, going online, or like in person, going knock at their door, influencing their decision, and so forth. I think that like heavy speculation and meme coins actually fall in that bucket. You know, you just swap some of the verbs a little bit, but it's very similar. And there's almost this kind of like Goldilocks zone where you want to stack different contexts, you know, whether it's people, whether it's engineering, whether it's market, whether it's chance. And you can think of these contexts as dimensions. And you want to make sure that if someone is like not really good at either of these, one of the dimensions is not zero because you multiply them together. So you don't want to put together a world where like, hey, actually, if this is gibberish to you, I mean, it is gibberish to me either, I don't know what this picture is, but imagine this is some clever programming stuff. If this is gibberish to you, you don't want this dimension to essentially collapse the whole thing to zero, right? Because you have not succeeded. At the same time, you have this other optimization process, which is you want to make sure that one of these dimensions is really hard for machines when you factor them together. And so you don't want to go with either. You don't want to be like, oh, I'm just purely going to make a market, or I'm purely going to go with like a gambling game, or I'm purely going to say, hey, here's this like seller automata. No, people are going to build something cool, and you're very surprised when no one spends more than 5 minutes on your thing. And I kind of like, you can kind of sum it up as this idea of like, you want to put a problem together that is so hard to solve, yet interesting, even when you're bad at it, in order to get people to like build, whether it's a civilization, whether it's an organization, whether it's, I don't know, a cult, without giving up immediately, right? You want the words that, like the verbs that come out of it to be things like indoctrinate, engineer, deceive, strategize, gamble, accumulate. And oh, one more thing I wanted to add there. I think that's why people are so kind of like obsessed and interested with Eve Online. One thing that is really interesting with Eve is that even if the game fundamental principle has not changed that much over the last 20 years, there has been a clear kind of like level up when it comes to the player's ability to master every single one of these verbs further. And there's a space for everyone to participate, you know. So yeah, I don't know how to solve this challenge, but I find it quite interesting that as soon as you open up dramatically the design space to now anyone can participate, you know, like whether it's very sophisticated financial actors, whether it's very sophisticated machines, you kind of have to master this switching of context and like putting together like a line for your design through all of this. Another thought I had in the plane today is an observation. So this is one of my favorite books. It's basically a book about the philosophy of game, then what a game is, etc. I'll spare you the detail. But one interesting thing is Suits, who's the author's definition of game, is that it's the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles, right? And one example he gives is the athletic track. So you can totally like, let's say you're here, if nobody looks at you, you can kind of like cross the thing and go on the other side. But the issue is like, you might win if you do this and nobody sees you, but as soon as you stop buying into the unnecessary obstacles, you've essentially like disqualified yourself from playing in the first place, right? And it's pretty interesting because most things in our world today are not like this. If there was a shortcut, we would have taken it, and the shortcut would have been celebrated. I love how like Trump is so good at like framing things in like a completely different way. And when people tell him, "Oh, you committed tax fraud," he's like, "But I'm smart." And then people are like, "Whoa, he's smart. That's true." And then they fall into it, you know. So it's very rare that like we can when there is a way to kind of like cross the athletic track, like people just like people often do it. And like a lot of civilization, whether it's like engineering, physics, whatever, is built on crossing the athletic track and not respecting the rule. And if I kind of put like my Bitcoiner hat for a bit, right? It's really interesting that a lot of things when it comes to like early cryptocurrency ideas are very similar to like, hey, you can cross the track if you want, but it's not crossing the track that enables you to participate, right? Like I could have made my own Bitcoin. You know, you can like fork the source code and give yourself a huge Genesis allocation, and you're like, oh, I crossed the athletic track, but that doesn't work, right? And you can tell me, well, it's exactly like going and flip some bits at the NYSE, you know, to make yourself rich. But the thing is, we often give that example, but you can't actually do it, right? Like the thing that is really interesting with these systems is you can actually cross the athletic track, but you disqualify yourself from the unnecessary obstacles. And it's really interesting that this is very different from like all other asset class and productive work in society, where we keep crossing the track when we can. Like, think about this sentence for a little bit. Let me make Ethereum faster while maintaining decentralization and data availability. This seems like the athletic track to me a little bit. Of course, like that's kind of like a cynical view on it. I think all of these things are very useful, but I think it's interesting from that perspective, like why are games / virtual worlds and crypto systems so similar in so many ways? Like they cross path again and again in an almost suspicious way. This is, by the way, an Ethereum researcher in World of Warcraft from 2008. Vitalik got the word Ethereum from World of Warcraft itself when he was playing. And I think it's actually not that important that Vitalik started working on ETH after some like World of Warcraft like kind of like shenanigans. But I think it's interesting that we have these systems where in order to participate, you have to kind of like believe in these let's go back to like Suit's definition, in these like unnecessary obstacles. Okay, so that was two short thoughts, which brings us to something I've been thinking a lot about. And that idea is, okay, so when does the bit flips the atom, right? Because if you think about it, digital technologies have not served the bit that much. It's mostly about like serving the atom. And let me give some example. I think that digital is largely a pointer to the physical world, right? Like digital technology today mostly gives us like convenience. AI is like intelligence, but in the real world, digital banking, the news, Uber Eats, whatever. And if you kind of like try to make some prediction in the 1980s about where this would all go, you would be a little bit surprised. And kind of like, I have some examples later. I want to illustrate what I mean by the bit flipping the atom. So if you think of Bitcoin and PayPal, it's kind of like a very similar system from the perspective of like what it is for the user. But one is clearly bit over atom. Like PayPal is a proxy system to a monetary system backed by nukes, violence, and oil. And Bitcoin is the athletic track. and same with like Instagram kind of blows my mind because it's like this massive digital network that just has picture of real people. Like it could have been anything else. Could have been like stuff that was generated we could look at. It could have been anything, but it ended up being pictures of real people, right? And you compare that to like spaceship on the internet, which was kind of like the soundbite for like what Eve was described like 20 years ago, and that's clearly like bit over atom. Another example is the presidential football that the president of the United States chief of staff is carrying around that lets him start like a nuclear strike. Like that's a digital system, but there the atom is definitely more important than the bits. You know, it's just like a proxy to it. And so what's going on? Why isn't the bit flipping the atom more often? Why is it always at the fringe that it happens? Like on the left, these are clearly fringe systems, whereas on the right, these are like mainstream systems. And I've been kind of like thinking about this term, which is digital realism. And we define it as the belief in and commitment to the underlying reality of digital objects. So in other words, we think that digital objects are at least as real as other virtual constructs that we also consider first-class citizen, things like money, state, corporation, gender, social relationship, etc. And here, a digital object is something that can be found natively in cyberspace. So if I turn Bitcoiner for a bit, I think it's one of the biggest middle finger to the physicalists. And sometimes I complain that, you know, we started with like hyper-financialization from day one, but I think that starting with money was a statement. You know, it was like, hey, we have this thing that is key to this like massive construct we have today, which is capitalism, and we're gonna like make an athletic track version of it, and it's gonna be bigger than yours. It's not backed by nukes, violence, or gold. And I think the physicalists kind of like learned the cost of not playing. They learned how powerful supposedly arbitrary constraints are. And if you kind of like, so this is my favorite example. The Visions Pro commercial is watching the NFL. Like we have the like this most powerful consumer device of all time that allows you to be in like that kind of like covers most of your sensory inputs. And then the way they demonstrate it is like people watching 2 NFL games at the same time. That's like 100% atom flipping the bits, you know. Mongolia TikTok, USDC, trading gold on the internet. And then we have like all the weird stuff on the left side, you know. And I don't know like which side you should take, but once again, I find it really interesting that the right is like continuously picking up steam. You know, we build these digital technologies, but then we don't actually let the bit be more important than the atom. Another rant I'll go on, which is like, if you think about the simulation hypothesis, one of the big clues that people give for like, oh, it's possible that our universe is simulated, is that just look at the speed at which our computer graphics is progressing, you know? We have stuff like VR, soon we'll have brain-machine interface, AI, and so it's clear that this universe is probably simulated. And I think that my rebuttal is that our movies and special effects have gotten so good, we can't tell the difference with the real world. Like if you just go watch Dune 2, I mean, we know it's not the real world, but it's not like we see, you know, when you watch one of the original Star Wars and you have like the cardboard thing moving around and you're like, yeah, that's the Death Star, I believe it. But it doesn't make a movie more real to an audience in many ways, right? And so if you think about, like, this is the, kind of like the mainstream timeline for the simulation hypothesis. Oh, we're just gonna keep making like, you know, better computer graphics, better input-output, better ways to like being in an alternative reality till, you know, we go all the way to like, oh, like the bit has actually flipped the atom. And if you've like listened to previous talks of mine, I actually think there's a completely different path that also needs to be taken. Sorry, I don't think it has to be taken. I don't know if I'm a digital realist, but if you are, you should probably take this path. And so if your goal is to kind of like realizing the digital atom, like seriously, what started as like thinking about shit in our head to playing Dungeons and Dragons with our friends, to oh, here's like the first multi-user computer program, which was a MUD, multi-user dungeon, a way to kind of like play D&D online. You kind of you keep going on that spectrum, and it has nothing to do with graphics or like input output or whatever. And I think there's like so much ahead. Like this is kind of like what you guys are interested in, which is you believe that after this you get that. This So if you go from MUDs to something like this, it's the belief that like, hey, if we bring a capital network and a consensus algorithm, now this world is more real than this world. Now we're here. This is the big update since last year, which is cryptography is eating the lunch of blockchains. This is Nick Szabo diagram for the GOT protocol from the 1990s. It's the idea that we can create with cryptography a mutually trusted virtual computer. And it seems like this just keeps going forward. Like what used to be the kind of math you would send the autistic math graduates to, you know, like number theory and all of that, is now becoming like extremely useful for some like very weird reasons. In the last 5 years, we went from cryptography as locks and watches, you know, like mechanics for a long time, precision mechanics was only used for these two kinds of objects, to, well, mechanics now is everywhere. And it's kind of like the same thing that's happening with cryptography, right? So it seems like we keep getting these gifts from the universe that have nothing to do with like how much our body believe a world is real. It's more about how much like the universe believe a world is real. With quantum computers, actually this is like a recent discovery, we can do this thing called one-time signature, and we don't need blockchains anymore for things like reorganization and all that. We don't need consensus. We can just make these like weird kinds of signature. And we're probably going to keep going in that direction. You know, we're probably going to keep getting gifts from the universe that make some form of like set of rules and state more and more real. And I think this is very clearly trending in one direction. At what point are we not talking about virtual universe anymore, but just a universe itself, right? Like, why does math maps perfectly to physics? And I will ask the other question, which is like, why does cryptography, which is some abstract math that was not supposed to be connected to physics, actually allows us to create a form of physics in the digital world? And I think the writing is on the wall here, because after all, the universe fit within a 256-bit table many, many times over. So yeah, I think this might be our most noble pursuit. You know, what's the latest stage of any civilization? It's probably to build a new universe. And so I think we might be going towards that at some point. And I will leave you guys with this. Thank you. Can take questions. I don't know. I don't know if there are any questions worth asking. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is like, what's this all about? You know, like why are we even doing this in the first place? And um, I think that this path is very, very non-anthropomorphic. It's not really about humans. I think we had to torture our mind in order to understand mathematics in many ways. This is more about, okay, the universe doesn't care about humans, but it so happens that there's this like weird branch of stuff that we can use to build universes, but similarly, these universes are probably not going to be human friendly. I think this is like an adapter. It's like you have been co-evolving with the fauna and the flora on Earth, and your body has kind of like been adopted to be here. Like this, the spectrum of light we see is the one that is mostly represented on Earth, not other spectrums. So I think this is kind of like a ZK proof for humans that enables us to like map from one domain to another for free. So yeah, that's like our crutches. That's what we need to be able to walk around in this world. Your question was like, are we being obfuscated by graphics? I think this is like what I would say is like this is a harmonization tool. Like how do we get harmonized with these worlds? Like when you're gonna play a lot of the on-chain games today, they didn't invest much in that, but it doesn't matter because it's not like this can come later, and we know, or like it can come right now, but we know it's kind of like an orthogonal progression in many ways. Yeah. Okay, I see no more questions, so I think we can wrap it up here. Thank you, folks. Thanks.